In this lecture, we're continuing to explore the ways in which our underlying brain activity is deceptive and constructed. We're moving on now to perception. For example, in July 17, 1996, TWA Flight 800 crashed shortly after takeoff. There were many eyewitnesses who reported seeing a missile or a streak of light going to the plane. However, an exhaustive FBI and National Transportation and Safety Board investigation concluded that there was no missile. Therefore, what did all those eyewitnesses see? Another very dramatic example, in 1978, a red panda escaped from the Rotterdam Zoo. The story of the escaped panda ran in the local papers, following which there were hundreds of red panda sightings all over the city. However, it was soon discovered that the panda was killed just outside the zoo, and that the bear had died prior to the story and all of the sightings. Therefore, what did all of those hundreds of eyewitnesses see? It could not have been a red panda. Is seeing believing, or perhaps it's more accurate to say that believing is seeing? In this lecture, it's my job to convince you that you cannot trust anything you think you see or perceive. There are simply too many flaws in the ways our brain constructs these perceptions. Our perceptions are not passive. It's not like a tape recorder or a film camera where details are simply recorded as they come in. In fact, our brains actively construct a picture of what is going on around us based upon a tiny fraction of all the sensory information that's coming in. This introduces many opportunities for distortions and error. Magicians have learned over centuries, really, how to exploit the foibles of the brain's sensory processing. They have developed a practical knowledge of how to deceive you, how to do things right in front of your face without you seeing or perceiving that they happened. They use this knowledge for entertainment. However, it certainly is possible for these same tricks to be used for nefarious purposes. Art is another example in which artists, in this case, have learned how to exploit the ways in which our brain processes information in order to create a specific effect. For example, they have developed laws of perspective and dimensionality, the ability to create a three-dimensional image on a two-dimensional canvas. They do this without an underlying knowledge of the neuroscience, but just a practical knowledge of how the visual system works and how it constructs what we think we see. Perhaps the simplest demonstration of the constructed aspect of our sensory input is optical illusions. Illusions, all types of illusions by definition, are times when the brain constructs a sensory perception in an incorrect way. It's a misperception of reality. Generally, objects in our world appear to be stable and they appear to be accurate with respect to reality. That property psychologists refer to as constancy. And optical illusions, by definition, represent an exception to constancy, a time when objects are either not stable or they do not accord with reality. There is some kind of internal inconsistency or paradox in what we think we are seeing. This is because the brain has to make assumptions. It makes assumptions about what's likely to be true, and then it processes the sensory information based upon those assumptions. Most of the time, those assumptions are correct, but when they're not correct, that results in an optical illusion. Now, constructed optical illusions are designed to specifically exploit known ways in which the brain processes information. There are different types of optical illusions. There are perspective illusions, which all exploit the ways in which our brains construct three-dimensional images out of two-dimensional input. Visual input is all two-dimensional. Our retinas are a flat, if curved, surface. And the brain has to then infer from that two-dimensional input a three-dimensional world with relative size and distance and movement, for example. Mostly it does this with the stereoscopic vision, the fact that it has input from two different eyes that it can compare. But even with just input from one eye, and you can test this yourself by closing off one eye, the brain can make reasonable inferences about the three-dimensionality of the world around it. There are optical illusions that are also based upon relative shade and size of objects. There are illusions based upon ambiguous stimuli, where the brain can construct the image in more than one way, and your brain will tend to switch back and forth between different constructions. And there are after-image optical illusions. The visual system will adapt to lighting and color, for example, and then when that is changed, the adaptation causes an after-image that's not really there. Some examples of optical illusions that are fairly dramatic, in my opinion, include a shading illusion. In this illusion, a shadow is falling across a checkerboard. Now, the light squares in the shadow appear to be lighter than the dark squares outside of the shadow, even though they are, in fact, the exact same shade. You can move the squares next to each other and see that the shade is identical. But your brain makes the lighter shadows, the lighter squares in the shadow, seem lighter relative to the darker squares, and the darker squares outside the shadow seem darker relative to the lighter squares. That's a brain processing thing that alters how you see the shade of those squares. You can't unsee this optical illusion even when you know exactly what is happening. The same thing is true of size. For example, the moon horizon illusion. The moon appears to be bigger when it's on the horizon than when it is overhead, but this is in fact not true. It is merely an illusion that is resulting from the fact that when the moon's on the horizon, there are objects, trees and buildings, etc., that give perspective. When the moon is high in the sky, there's nothing to compare it to, so it seems relatively smaller. Some other three-dimensional illusions, again, the brain makes assumptions about size, distance, and relative position. These assumptions are based upon what is usually correct, but when one or more of those assumptions are incorrect, the brain can construct a false three-dimensional image of reality. The ability to judge distance is especially important. No one is immune to these factors, poor viewing conditions, to lack of a clear reference, for example. So even being a trained pilot or a trained observer does not make your brain construct things differently or make you immune to these illusions. Three-dimensional images are a construction. It is something that is happening inside your brain, and that's important to remember. There are also perceptual reversals. This has to do with ambiguous stimuli, your brain constructing images in different ways at different times. There is the classic cube illusion, for example, where you have a two-dimensional drawing of a three-dimensional cube, and either face can be perceived as pointing towards you at any one time, and in your brain the cube can flip back and forth between facing one direction or another. There is also a spinning silhouette illusion, a silhouette of a young female dancer spinning around, and your brain can perceive her as either spinning clockwise or counterclockwise, and it will tend to flip back and forth between one direction and the other. That's because the illusion, the spinning silhouette, is compatible with rotating in either direction. Your brain can construct the shadows and the perspective either way. Research looking at how people perceive the spinning silhouette illusion also reveal other influences, such as perspective biases. For example, we assume that our brains tend to assume that what we are viewing is receiving light from above. There is a lighting from above bias in how we construct images. And this does tend to make certain versions of the spinning silhouette illusion appear to be moving in one direction more often than the other. Another ambiguous stimuli illusion, this one is a very classic one, is the old-young woman illusion. In this, you have a picture that can be constructed either as an old woman looking in one direction or a young woman looking in the other direction. The ambiguous stimuli can be constructed in different ways. There is also the horse camouflage illusion. A picture of a snowy landscape with rocks could appear to be just that. However, the snowy and the rocky areas are laid out in such a way that it actually suggests the shape of a horse with brown spots on white fur. Your brain may or may not put that together into the shape. When it does, however, then the picture of the horses will snap into place, and then you cannot unsee those horses. This is also a process of your brain filling in missing information. The outline of the horse is just suggested by the drawing, and then your brain will fill in the details. The image again snaps into place. These types of optical illusions I've been talking about has relevance for UFO sightings, for example. Pilots or others believing they see an unidentified flying object. For example, in 1997, a military helicopter reported seeing what they thought was another aircraft that was about to collide with them. They, in fact, took evasive action. However, it turns out that what they were viewing was simply a mylar balloon. It was a small, metallic balloon. However, the pilot, again, a trained pilot, somebody with a lot of experience who you would think would be able to distinguish a balloon from an aircraft, was unable to do so. His brain made wrong assumptions about distance, and everything else flowed from there. Of course, your brain could see the object as being far away, large, and moving very rapidly, or it could be close, small, and moving very slowly. Your brain can construct it either way. The pilot's brain thought that he was seeing a large aircraft moving quickly towards him, when in fact it was a small balloon just drifting by. Another example, the Stephenville Light UFO of January 8th, 2008. Some witnesses saw a UFO 1 mile long. Investigation reveals, however, that these were simply flares that were dropped by F-16s. However, the witnesses constructed the UFO by connecting the dots. This is something that our brains do when it's constructing our perception of the world around us. It will fill in lines or connections where it thinks they should be based upon assumptions about what it thinks it's seeing. In this case, 3 disconnected dots were perceived of as being part of one massive mile-long object. Another example of how it's possible to think you're seeing something that's not there simply because of the situation is the Battle of LA. Now, I'm not referring to the 2011 movie, but rather the air raid over Los Angeles that took place on February 25th, 1942. Over 1,400 anti-aircraft shells were fired. Eventually, however, it was concluded that the entire air raid was simply a false alarm, probably the result of war nerves. This was towards the beginning of World War II. And it might have been triggered by something as innocuous as a weather balloon. However, once the shells were started to fire, the soldiers who were manning these anti-aircraft batteries were firing at something. They thought that they were seeing planes invading the west coast of the United States. Another dramatic example of how our brain constructs a picture in our heads from the sensory input is the fact that the different senses can actually influence each other. Our brains will compare different types of sensory input in order to construct one seamless picture out of all of them. And it will adjust one sense or the other in order to make things match. One example of this is a 2001 wine test by Moreau, Brochet, and Dubardeau. What they did was they colored white wine with red food coloring. They then gave the red wine to wine tasting experts and asked them to describe what they were tasting. The experts used objects to describe the odors and the taste that was the same color as the wine being tasted. In other words, they were describing the white wine as if it were a red wine. They were fooled, apparently. Their very highly developed and sophisticated wine-tasting sense was fooled merely by the color of the wine they thought they were drinking. In a related study, Brochet placed the same exact wine into different bottles with then either cheap or expensive labels. Wine tasting experts were then asked to compare the different wines and rate them. They rated the wine with the expensive label in glowing terms, while denigrating the same exact wine with the cheap label as unworthy. Here we could see how perception was fairly dramatically influenced by mere expectation, even among experts. Gender perception is something else which is also a combination of different types of sensory input. You might think that it's purely visual. Does someone look male or do they look female? However, there are numerous studies which indicate that what we see in terms of gender is affected by the voice that we hear, especially when the visual input is ambiguous or androgynous. We will see an ambiguous or androgynous picture as male if it is accompanied by a male-sounding voice, and as female if it's accompanied by a female-sounding voice. This same research also shows that we respond better to congruous sensory input when the voice matches the face we see it coming from and the movements that are being made, rather than incongruous. Sometimes our brain will have difficulty putting conflicting sensory input together. Another, again, very dramatic example of how our brain uses different types of sensory input in order to construct its picture is the so-called McGurk effect, after the researcher who first described it. The consonants that we hear are affected by the mouth movements that we see. For example, if you hear someone say ba, and while looking at video of someone saying ba or fa or da or va, we will actually hear what we see people saying. What we hear will be dramatically influenced by the mouth movements that we are actually seeing. Our brain adjusts the sound in order to make it congruous with the lip movements that we see. You actually hear different consonants when this is happening. Again, a very dramatic example of how our brains are modifying, altering, constructing the sensory input. There is also temporal synchronization. Sounds and sights, like clapping hands, seem to be simultaneous. However, the light traveling from somebody clapping their hands travels much faster than the sound waves propagate. Therefore, the two sensory inputs do not arrive at your sensory organs, at exactly the same time. It also takes a slightly different amount of time for your brain to process those two types of information. And yet, when we look at somebody clapping their hands, the two events appear to be exactly simultaneous. That, however, is a constructed illusion in your brain. Your brain synchronizes the two events because it knows that they're supposed to occur at the same time. In fact, as long as the visual and auditory information are within 80 milliseconds of each other, your brain will perceive them as being simultaneous. So, therefore, if someone is clapping their hands while moving farther and farther away from you, and therefore the difference in time between the visual and auditory information is getting farther and farther apart, they will still seem to be synchronous, seem to be occurring at the exact same moment until they are arriving at greater than 80 milliseconds apart, which will occur when someone is about 90 feet or 27 meters away. At that point, they will suddenly become noticeably asynchronous. So it's not the kind of thing that happens gradually. Your brain keeps them synchronous until you're outside of that 80 millisecond window, and then it's suddenly noticeably asynchronous. It's also true that our brains actually see, or at least infer, a little bit into the future. When we catch a baseball, the 80 milliseconds it takes for your brain to process the visual information would make you miss the ball every time. You would be 80 milliseconds behind reality. It may not make a difference in everyday activity, but when you're trying to catch a fast-moving ball, those 80 milliseconds will make a difference. So our brains evolved in order to compensate for that. They actually project rapid movement slightly into the future in order to compensate for this 80 millisecond delay due to processing. Another example, this one is a so-called pathological example, meaning it doesn't occur in everybody, but it does occur in some people, and that is called synesthesia. Synesthesia is a phenomenon when one sensory modality is interpreted by the brain as if it were a different sensory modality. Therefore, people with synesthesia may see numbers or hear light or smell colors. A color will have a smell to them. This happens because one part of the brain is interpreting sensory input of a different sort. So if you have visual information going to your auditory cortex, the auditory cortex will interpret it in the way that it knows how, as a sound. You will be able to hear light. It's not clear whether this synesthesia represents a bleeding over of information from one sensory area to an adjacent sensory area in the brain, or if there are actually specific connections being made, if this is an alternate type of wiring in the brain. To some extent, there is some synesthesia, even in all so-called normal, neurologically typical individuals. Again, our brains do compare and do use the information. That visual information is influencing the auditory cortex, as in the McGurk effect. So there is some cross-processing going on. With synesthesia, it's just much more dramatic. So up to this point, I've been talking about the ways in which our brain constructs the sensory information that's coming into us, makes assumptions, alters it, highlights certain things, for example, in order for the information to be useful to us, but at the same time introducing artifacts and error. Now I'm going to shift a little bit to the ways in which we pay attention to that sensory information. Attention is hugely important to the notion of perception because we are being bombarded with an overwhelming amount of sensory information. You cannot possibly pay attention to even a significant fraction, let alone all of it, at the same time. So we filter out most sensory information that is reaching us, and we pay attention to only a very tiny amount of it, what our brains deem to be important. Again, that's something that magicians have learned to exploit. They know how to make your brain attend to one area or to one thing that's happening and completely ignore and not perceive at all something else that's happening, even though it's right in front of you. There are some now famous experiments in which this is demonstrated very dramatically. Subjects are asked to watch a video, for example, in which they are instructed to focus or pay attention to one type of activity that's happening in the video, while at the same time something else very dramatic is happening in the video right before your eyes. And about 60% or so of people who watch the video will completely miss it. They will be completely unaware of dramatic events happening right before their eyes simply because they were instructed to attend to a different part of what was happening in the video. In fact, our focus, the amount of focus that we have, can also shift around. We can be focused on just one part of our visual field with completely ignoring the peripheral vision, or we can be on the lookout trying to diffuse our attention among a greater percentage of our visual field. In fact, only the very center of the visual field is highly detailed. If you hold out your thumb at arm's length, the size of the thumb is about the area where you have 20/20 vision if your vision is normal and healthy. Everywhere else, you have very extremely poor vision. And you generally can't pay attention to every part of your peripheral visual field at the same time. We do tend to shift around to, say, the upper left or the lower left part of our peripheral vision at different times. When you do that, when you attend to one part of the visual field, the objects in that part of the visual field are actually enhanced. Your brain will process more of the information coming from that part of the visual field, and it will suppress information coming from other parts of the visual field. And that is an important concept as well. It's not just that we're paying attention to only one part of our sensory information. When we do that, we actually suppress information coming from elsewhere in order for our brains to prevent getting distracted by all sorts of what it deems to be, at the moment, irrelevant information. So what I described is what we call inattentional or attentional blindness. We are blind to things that we are not attending to. There is another very closely related phenomenon called change blindness. With change blindness, we do not notice sometimes even dramatic changes that happen in our environment. For example, if you're looking at a picture with a lot of elements in it, and the picture flashes on and off, so you're not looking at it continuously, very dramatic changes can happen to that picture, to that scene, in the flashes, that it will be very difficult for you to perceive. You will not notice most of them. You will be blind to the change. Researchers have explored the extent to which we can be blind to even significant changes. For example, now there are several experiments showing that when interacting with an unfamiliar person, somebody you don't know personally, that person can actually change outside of your view. And about 60% of the time, subjects won't notice that they're talking to a different person than they were just a moment ago. Even a dramatic change such as that, changing one person for an entirely different person, can escape our notice. An example of our ability to only attend to a small number of things at the same time is multitasking. The term multitasking itself is sort of a recent invention used to define doing more than one thing at the same time. The research shows, however, that people essentially can't do this. We cannot attend to more than one thing at the same time. What people do when they are multitasking is they shift their attention back and forth between or among the things that they are doing or that they are attending to. But they only have so much attention. They can only give attention to just one thing at a time. In experiments, only about 2.5% of people, for example, were able to talk and drive at the same time without a reduction in their driving performance. That's a very small number. The rest of the people had a significant decrease in their driving performance while they were attempting to attend to something else at the same time. In other experiments, it's ironically been demonstrated that people who think that they are good at multitasking actually suffered from multitasking the most. Their performance went down the greatest when they attempted to multitask. Therefore, dividing our attention uses up cognitive resources. It is exactly as if you, say, have 100% of your attention. If you divide it between two things, then each is getting 50% of your attention and performance goes down by 50%. In addition, it may be a little bit worse than that because you're expending a little bit of your resources to switch back and forth, and therefore both tasks suffer even more than if you were just focusing on one at a time. Talking on your cell phone while driving is now a very important example of this. And that's why many states now have laws that prohibit doing that, because your ability to attend to what's happening around you significantly decreases when you're just having a conversation. Eyewitness testimony is therefore notoriously unreliable if everything I've said in this lecture up to this point is true. Eyewitnesses are subject to suggestion. They have a false confidence in their own accuracy, and they're subject to confabulation, making up details. Remember, I said that our brains construct a narrative, a story. They construct a consistent reality out of what it thinks it perceives. And part of that construction is to fill in missing pieces. That's called confabulation. And people will do that subconsciously, automatically, and they will think that these pieces that they added were perceived, were actually out there in reality. Therefore, perception is a construct. That's the bottom line lesson of this lecture. It is something that is happening inside your brain. Each individual sensory stream is interpreted and modified. The different streams are combined and compared and then altered based upon that comparison. And we attend to a very small subset of that information, which we then weave into a whole story, adding in confabulating pieces as needed. The end result is a story that is largely a fiction. The brain creates illusions of a continuous congruent reality, fills in the gaps as needed, makes assumptions that are usually but not always true, resulting in illusions that are dramatic when they're specifically designed to trick the brain. But this happens to us every day. Every day that as we're going through our lives, we don't get this objective, perfect view of reality around us. We have this very, very imperfect, constructed view. There are also higher order constructions. In a subsequent lecture, I will talk about how sensory input is constructed into meaningful patterns. So not only are the components of what we perceive constructed, how we put it together into a meaningful way is also constructed. This will often result in unnecessary arguments from what I call an irrational faith in the fidelity of our own perceptions. If, however, we understand the limits of our perceptions, then we will not overly rely upon them. We will not say, hey, I saw it with my own eyes, seeing is believing. We'll say, I think I saw this, but honestly, I don't know, and I can't really know exactly what I saw because it was something that was constructed by my brain. In the next lecture, I'm going to talk about memory, because as soon as you perceive something, it becomes a memory. So what you really have are memories, which themselves are constructed and altered, of what you think you saw. In lecture 4, I will go over in more detail how our memories are also constructed.